So without further ado, Professor Richard Jackson from Otago University on Pacifism and the Cult of Violence in Counter-Terrorism.
Kia ora, everyone from New Zealand, as we say over here. Can you hear me okay? Great. So my sincere thanks to the IAS at Loughborough for the invitation to participate today. I'm only sorry that I can't be there in person and visit with you. I would have liked that, but unfortunately global events have prevented this. I'd also like to particularly thank Alex for facilitating and organising the event today, as well as all the other great events that he's been working on this year in support of this fantastic new journal. And of course, congratulations, Alex, on your well-deserved promotion. So as you will have heard yesterday, and as you will hear in the other presentations today, Pacifism provides a credible and useful set of analytical tools and ethical perspectives for understanding issues like power, agency, resistance, peace, war, civilian protection, and a great many other subjects in contemporary international politics. And this is in spite of its persistent subjugation and delegitimation as a form of knowledge in the wider political field. To quote Foucault, pacifism has long been considered, in our society at least, one of those knowledges that have been disqualified as non-conceptual knowledges, as insufficiently elaborated knowledges, naive knowledges, hierarchically inferior knowledges, knowledges that are below the required level of erudition or scientificity. However, notwithstanding its subjugated nature and the specific relevance for this talk, pacifism advances, I believe, a sophisticated and realistic understanding of the nature and effects of violence as a mode of political action, whether it be the violence of war, humanitarian intervention, or indeed counter-terrorism. Employing a pacifistic critique of violence and also adopting an anthropological sensibility, it's possible to see how the current and very much dominant devotion to violence as a tool or mode of politics borders on the fetishistic or cultic. In particular, it can be argued that the veneration and devotion to violence in the political field is often characterized by what we could call magical thinking, which can be understood as beliefs and behaviors in which the relationship between an act and its effects is not empirically or scientifically verified, but rather rests on analogy or a mystical connection. Certainly, it relies more on imagination and desire than it does on reality and empirical evidence. Moreover, similar to the internal culture of cults, the devotion to violence in our society is often accompanied by sacred rituals and a kind of secular religion in which any questioning of the morality or the efficacy of violence is viewed as a kind of betrayal or evidence of mental incompetence. This is observable in the ritual, cultural, political practices of war remembrance, which those of us here in New Zealand and Australia experience most vividly around Anzac, which took place this last Monday. Interestingly, it can also be observed in the way that the magical thinking of just war theory works, including its failure to acknowledge empirical evidence, its adherence to paradoxical or contradictory precepts, and no small amount of cognitive dissonance, its reliance on abstraction, analogy, and mystical connections. And just war theory is also ritually performed in defense of military action and functions to subjugate, dismiss, and abuse alternative ethical positions like pacifism. So in a paper at the recent PSA conference, which was also organized by Alex and including some of those who presented yesterday, I discussed the cult of violence in politics generally. I discussed many of the powerful empirical, theoretical, and ethical arguments which raise serious doubts about the notion that violence can be, or should be in an ethical sense, a tool of politics or security. I suggested that violence is demonstrably ineffective in achieving strategic, political, or normative goals, except in some short-term instances. I also argued that it's antithetical to politics and democratic participation. It's self-perpetuating and self-fulfilling as a social system. And as a mode of power, it limits social possibilities to the continuation of a violent, dominatory sovereign order. In other words, it's a very poor and unreliable tool of revolutionary or emancipatory change. But perhaps it is a useful tool for maintaining the current violent, unequal status quo. Further, I argued that the reasons why the belief in the magical properties of violence persist, in spite of the vast evidence and arguments arrayed against it, is in part due to the dominance of just war thinking, misconceptions about the relationship between violence and power, and misunderstandings about its supposedly instrumental nature. Today, I intend to focus a little more specifically on the cult of violence and counterterrorism. This is a subject I've been studying closely for more than 20 years now, and I would argue that few other areas of politics demonstrate the fallibilities of violence more than contemporary counterterrorism. There is no question at all that the cult of violence reigns supreme in the counterterrorism area. States have responded to terrorism and campaigns of terrorism with excessive violence long before the launch of the global war on terror in 2001. British actions in Malaya, Cyprus, and Northern Ireland, French actions in Algeria, Spanish actions in the Basque Country, Turkish responses to Kurdish terrorism, the Argentinian military's response to left-wing violence, the South African government's response to the ANC. These are all examples of the primacy of violent retaliation and suppression as the dominant mode of counterterrorism. After 9/11, a war-based military response to terrorism was launched, which was characterized by military invasions, operations and occupations, the widespread torture and coercive interrogation of terrorist suspects, drone killing programs, extraordinary rendition and preventive detention, shoot-to-kill policies, and a great many other violently coercive measures. Alongside this, the war on terror has involved military training and exchange programs with dozens of states, the expansion of military bases across the world, the development of new counterterrorism technologies, and the emergence of psychologically violent counterterrorism measures, including some forms of so-called counter-radicalization or countering violent extremism programs. The cult of violence in counterterrorism, similar to the cult of violence in politics generally, has persisted in its magical thinking about the instrumental utility of violence as a tool of policy, despite the growing empirical evidence of its declining effectiveness and its limited ability to achieve strategic political or normative goals. And despite the accumulating evidence for the lasting harms that it continues to inflict on individuals, communities, nations, and the wider international system. As the noted pacifist scholar Dustin Howes observed, there is, and I quote, gathering evidence for the ineffectiveness of violence in a variety of empirical literatures. And ultimately, in believing that violence can serve strategic and normative ends, I quote, the practitioners of violence are more often the tragic idealists than pacifists. The growing empirical evidence for the failure of violent forms of counterterrorism includes studies which have found that rather than reducing the amount of terrorism, harsh state repression is a major cause of suicide bombing. And that while forms of repression that close off non-violent avenues of dissent and boost group grievances increase the amount of domestic terrorism a country faces, types of repression that raise the cost of terrorist activity have no discernible effect on terrorism. Other recent empirical research has confirmed that states experience more terrorism after they engage in military intervention, which in turn confirms the earlier work of Robert Pape in 2005, for example, which found that military occupation is a clear driver of campaigns of suicide terrorism. In terms of specific counterterrorism tools, there have been numerous studies on the effectiveness of targeted killing of terrorists by drone strikes, or so-called leadership decapitation strategies. A large number of these studies find that they are either ineffective or counterproductive. Abrams and McCrell, for example, conclude that leadership decapitation leads to greater indiscriminate violence by militant groups. In the case of torture as a tool of counterterrorism, the evidence is clear. From studies based on game theory to detailed extensive case study analysis, surveys of professional interrogators, the neuroscience of interrogation, and a great many other studies, it can be confidently asserted that torture has proven to be an ineffective counterterrorism tool, and most likely a recruitment driver for terrorist groups. In other words, the accumulation of empirical evidence demonstrates that the use of violent forms of counterterrorism, at the very least, is ineffective and doesn't work. In actual fact, it likely makes terrorism worse. Lastly, there is long-standing and mounting evidence that the effects of counterterrorism measures, particularly violent measures, regardless of whether they are effective in reducing the number of terrorist attacks, are harmful to human rights, civil liberties, social cohesion, and other collective values. It may be that a terrorist campaign can be effectively halted in the short term, but only by the widespread violation of human rights and the alteration of society's entire way of life, which might be a price too high. The price of the war on terror, which by some accounts has cost more than 1 million lives, tens of millions displaced, hundreds of thousands tortured and interned, and untold numbers of human rights abuses, has certainly been too high. The counterterrorism cure in this case has been far worse than the terrorism disease it was designed to cure. What I'm arguing here is that the counterterrorism field is in fact no different from the broader political field. Both fail to acknowledge the accumulation of empirical evidence which clearly demonstrates the declining utility of violence and military force. In addition, the counterterrorism field, just like the political field, also labors under fundamental misunderstandings about the relationship between power and violence, the nature of force and violence as an instrument of security policy, and the distorted ethical reasoning of just war theory. I don't have time to go into these arguments here, but have in any case published extensively on them and are happy to share those readings. However, there are a few more specific reasons for the persistence of the cult of violence and counterterrorism. I don't also have time to go into them in great detail, but they must include, and I'll just talk about them briefly now, the dominance of a dehumanizing and demonizing discourse of terrorism, which permits and indeed encourages the use of violence against terrorist suspects, who are no longer viewed as fully human and fully deserving of human rights. It would also include misunderstandings about the origins and causes of terrorism in the first instance, locating it in evil or fanaticism. This is an example of the willful rejection of empirical evidence about the political motives, grievances, and social conditions which produce violent politics like terrorism, for myths and magical thinking about who terrorists are, what they want, and what their goals are. Another reason specific to counterterrorism is the failure to appreciate the constitutive and self-fulfilling effects of violent forms of counterterrorism. It is part of a realistic understanding of violence to note that the effectiveness of violence to compel or deter depends entirely on how people respond to the violence, not the violence itself. The capacity to destroy bears no direct relation to the ability to coerce. The application of violence can provoke either submission or resistance, deterrence or retaliation, and the response is never guaranteed. As the war on terror and Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the moment aptly demonstrate. The war on terror has in fact created more terrorist groups and provoked more terrorism than it stopped and that existed before it started. Another aspect is the embrace of what I have called the epistemological crisis of counterterrorism by officials, which is a condition in which previous knowledge about terrorism has been rejected as no longer applicable in the post 9/11 period. This is what Lisa Stampnitsky calls the politics of anti-knowledge. When this is combined with an extreme risk aversion, it creates an epistemological crisis in the counterterrorism mind. In this state of crisis, counter-terrorists are encouraged to instead use their imagination in detecting and defeating terrorism. This is a clear example, I feel, of another form of magical thinking about violence. Another reason, which is highly visible in counterterrorism, but not specific to it, because there is rarely any systematic evaluation of the use of military force in politics, is the failure to learn through evaluation. It's an extraordinary situation that despite spending literally trillions of dollars and expending thousands of lives in counterterrorism campaigns, no government has yet undertaken a rigorous empirical evaluation of the effectiveness of counterterrorism measures. This again is an example of the willful rejection of empirical evidence and instead the embrace of magical, wishful thinking about how counterterrorism measures will work to defeat terrorism. It is an example of the cult of violence. There is also a willful ignorance or subjugation about the knowledge of alternatives to violence and non-violent forms of counterterrorism and non-violent forms of political action. And then finally, we should also note that this condition persists because of the embedded material interests that persist in the counterterrorism and indeed the security and military industry. In the end, and particularly in light of the spectacular failures of the world's preeminent military powers to achieve their strategic and military goals, despite their overwhelming capacity for violence, and here I'm referring to the United States' failure to achieve any of its goals despite 20 years of effort against poorly armed opponents in Afghanistan, as well as Russia's unfolding failures in Ukraine, it seems like an ideal moment to acknowledge that the counterterrorism field and the political field more generally has made a major error. It has failed to seriously engage with or even acknowledge the evidence and arguments about the limitations and failures of violence, and has instead persisted with magical thinking and idealistic imaginings about the ends that can be achieved through the means of violence. Fortunately, pacifism is here to furnish a more realistic, a more ethical, and a potentially more effective and more emancipatory approach to politics and political action and security. Rooted in rigorous and objective assessment of the nature and effects of violence, as well as real-world nonviolent struggles for social justice, pacifism offers, I believe, genuine alternatives to the endless recurring bouts of political violence we see all around us today. It also offers realistic and potentially more effective alternatives to the current violent magical thinking about counterterrorism. Serious scholarship and serious political theory and praxis demands a serious engagement with the insights of pacifism and nonviolence, as we are rightly doing today and as the new journal intends to also do. And I, for one, look forward to being part of this important discussion going forward. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention.